Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Dawn and I were really concerned about that 20 minutes ago, but it's her and me. So I am so very grateful to have all of you here tonight. Thank you for taking the time. Since we are in the church, I'm going to open with a word of prayer. Would you bow your head, please? Father God, we know you are God of justice and mercy. We know you care about gun violence, and it breaks your heart as it breaks ours. Lord God, fill this place with your spirit, that we might be about your business, that we might end the scourge of gun violence in our nation, and we might come together in peace and unity. And we pray these things, Father, for your glory, in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Tonight, I'm really pleased that we have a great panel of people here tonight. First of all, we have a Representative Vinkat, who is the Pennsylvania State House Representative from District 37.
30.
Oh, 30, I'm sorry, 30. And he is a great advocate for gun violence prevention. He has quite a unique perspective because not only is he a state representative, he is also an emergency room doctor. So he can talk about the control of gun violence and also address how we can address that gun violence. Next, we have Babe Brown, who was a woman who I just met very recently. Babe's son was murdered with the victim of gun violence. So she has a very unique perspective on the gun violence and the effects that it has on the family. Next, we have Ashley Deemer, and she's a campaign director for CeaseFire, leading and supporting a statewide team of organizers and building powerful campaigns to push for life-saving action to end gun violence. CeaseFire's goal is really simple, that we can all live in society. So the way one little housekeeping note, the bathrooms are out the door to the right, refreshments are over here. The way we're going to go tonight is Representative Vinkat will talk, then we will give it over to Ms. Brown and the last Ashley, who will give us some things that we can do to lead on the forefront of gun violence prevention. Then we will open it up for questions. Yeah, hopefully answers. So thanks again, Representative Vinkat.
Do you want to see?
You can use this.
Oh,
You're
perfect.
good.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. All right. So my name is Arvind Vinkat. I'm the state representative for the 30th legislative district, which is the western part of Hampton Township, all of McCandless, Franklin Park, Ohio Township, Kilbuck, Emsworth, Ben Avon, and Ben Avon Heights. For those of you who are from those communities, thank you for being here today. It's an honor to represent you. For those of you who are from outside those communities, welcome to Franklin Park within the district. It's an honor to host you here in the 30th district. And I want to thank Marilyn Mulvihill and CeaseFire PA for the kind invitation. As Marilyn noted, I am an emergency physician. I am the first physician to serve in our legislature since the mid-1960s. And I still practice as an emergency physician, but not in a high acuity place. However, between 1996, when I started medical school, and 2022, when I was first elected to the legislature, I practiced in every stage of my training and in practice at level 1 trauma centers. And as a result, I saw every type of gun victim you can imagine and ones you don't want to imagine. One that has continued to kind of stick in my head and is really one of the really one or two times that I've cried while working in the emergency department was when I was working a very busy afternoon shift and we got a call that a 2-year-old was coming in with a gunshot wound to the chest and that he had no signs of life. He came into the emergency department as described. We tried our best to resuscitate him, and we could not succeed. And when those parents showed up, and the story we've heard was that somehow that toddler had gotten into their father's gun and had accidentally shot himself. You can imagine the reactions. And I'd love to say that that's only happened once, but accidental shootings among children happen all the time. Suicides happen all the time. Attempted suicides happen all the time. Mass shootings happen all the time. I've seen young and old, rich and poor, white and black, you name it. Every victim you can imagine show up in emergency departments with so-called minor gunshot wounds, which doesn't recognize the mental trauma that comes from being shot, and that you carry with you for the rest of your life, to people losing the ability to walk, losing the ability to control their own bodily functions, requiring to be on a ventilator for the rest of their life. And we are the only industrialized country in the world that has this problem. Everyone else has recognized that even if you believe in the individual right to own a firearm, which I think in our country, we do have that constitutional right, that there is a responsibility that goes along with it. And when I ran for office in these communities, I joked at the time that I really hoped that my campaign would not be about guns and abortion. And of course, that's exactly what my campaign turned out to be about, because that's what the voters wanted me to talk about. And so I told my story of treating gun victims over and over and over again, and that we could pass common sense gun safety legislation, background checks, red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of those who've shown a propensity for violence, safe storage that would have hopefully prevented what happened with the 2-year-old that I lost. Reporting of lost and stolen firearms, which is a very backdoor way that guns end up in the black market. Getting rid of ghost guns, because guns that do not have a serial number cannot be tracked. And as a result, law enforcement cannot take action when they're used in a crime. Those are things that I have advocated for, certainly throughout my political career. And this is where elections have consequences. My election and others elected at the same time allowed us to flip control of the state house. And we were able to vote on those types of legislation for the first time in 12 years. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. None of them got a further vote in the state Senate, which is controlled by Republicans. And so what I will leave with you simply is that we can have conversations among ourselves about the necessity of these types of interventions. And I think the evidence for them is crystal clear. But we have to win elections in order to be able to have leaders in place that allows legislation like this to move forward. That is the truth. When you look at states around the country, when you look at the federal government, we're not going to see any type of gun safety legislation. We're going to see the opposite over the next 2 years. What will be very interesting to see is that in the Biden administration, there was a passage of a federal gun safety law. Part of it was worked on by Senator John Cornyn, a very conservative Republican in Texas. He is now being primaried, and he is behind that primary. And if he loses that primary, then that is going to be a message to every Republican in DC, and frankly, every Republican in Harrisburg: you do not step out of line on the gun issue. I have colleagues in the Democratic caucus in the House who represent communities that would crucify them if they were pro-gun safety legislators. they are our majority makers in terms of doing the many things that we try to do as House Democrats in the majority. So we need to win elections, and there are elections here in Allegheny County. I'm not going to be explicitly partisan because CeaseFire PA is not an explicitly partisan organization. I will say that voters need to educate themselves on the opportunities that are there and make sure that this is an issue that not only you care about, but that your neighbors care about, and that candidates like that who care about it have your support. That's how we're able to do this. And certainly for me as an emergency physician, this is not a hard call, and it is part of my moral core. And I will, if I lose an election because I was a gun safety candidate, so be it. But that's, we need to recognize that these are the political circumstances we're in today, and that we need to win elections to change that. It's that simple.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Babe?
Hi, my name is Babe Brown Smith. I'm 54 years old, pretty young. March 24th of 2024, my baby, Lante Smith, left outside the house to go visit one of his friends that lived 3 doors down. And 3 minutes later, my baby came back in holding his arm, saying he was shot in his arm. And there was blood splattered everywhere. And I froze. I froze because I felt like me and my husband worked so hard. And in these few seconds, this is what was running through my mind. Me and my husband worked so hard to have the little bit of things that we have to make sure that our kids were safe in a nice community. And my baby was shot right in front of me. Like I never thought that I could be a victim of my son getting shot. Dante was a really good kid. He played in every AAU basketball, every football. He was really a good person in a community. He was well respected by the elderlies. And I'm pointing this out because we do have to change the rules, because it could be any of our sons. I never expected it to be my son. When I froze, I knew that I had to come back to and help my son, because the last thing I heard my son say was, "Mom, come on, I need you." And I just snapped out. We have a Victorian house, so you could go this way and this way. My husband was in his man cave. We, both of us ran both ways and banged on his door because he keeps it locked. And when he came up to the steps, he was like, "Why are y'all banging on the door?" And I said, Tay's been shot. My husband froze too, but he immediately moved. Like he didn't think about who was outside, if the shooter still could have been outside. He didn't think about anything. He just rushed my son to the hospital, where he didn't make it. I mean, he still had a pulse, but he was going in and out. And Sincere, my son's friend, it was his friend. He slept in our house. He ate our food. He wore Lonte's clothes and everything. He apparently had a mental issue, and he didn't come from too good of a family background, but his mental issue is what was important to me. How did he get a gun? How was he able to kill my baby that looked after him, that made sure that he had, when he went off to college, we gave him $500 for him to go to school, because I knew that his parents and his grandparents weren't as fortunate. And it just, it changed our lives. Sincere didn't kill my son Lante. He gave Lante everlasting life. What Sincere did was he killed me and my husband. And it has to stop. No parent, mom or dad, should feel how we feel. We had a perfect life. And now, only by the grace of God can we still move, but it's important to make a move, to do what has to be done because everybody can't sit here and tell the story the way that I could tell it. To lose a child, blood of your blood, you lose yourself. And that's why I say Sincere didn't kill Lante. He gave Lante everlasting life. He killed me and my husband. We're like robots. All we could do is wake up to go to work, to come home, to go to sleep, to wake up, to go to work, to come home, to go to sleep. And that's not a life. That's nobody should have to live that way. So please vote. Please do whatever you have to do. Check the mental health. Educate. We have to be educated, not only on voting, but we have to be educated on mental health because, as I was explaining earlier, there's so many people that is carrying so much trauma and so much tragedy that we're programmed to move. We don't even know that we're carrying it. We don't even know that this is a part of our lives. And we have to move. We have to move different because everybody can't take losing a child. And trust me, it's not anything that anybody would want to have to live with.
Well, my name's Ashley Deemer, and I'm the campaign director for CeaseFire PA. I see some familiar faces here tonight. Thank you for coming. I want to tell you a little bit about CeaseFire PA and the solutions that we're advocating for to prevent violence like this in the future, and some actions you can take tonight to contact other legislators in the state House and Senate to get those solutions in place. So many of you are familiar with our work, but if you are not, CeaseFire PA has a vision of a future Pennsylvania where all people can live and work and play and learn in communities free from violence. A lot of us, whether we live in a community where there is imminent danger, we fear it every day, we're not living lives that are fully free. And for 20 years, CeaseFire PA has worked to end this epidemic of gun violence through legislation in the state House and Senate right here in Pennsylvania. We have stood up to the gun lobby, which, as you all know, I'm sure is very powerful and well-funded. We have galvanized the public, people like you across Pennsylvania who support an end to this epidemic, to speak to their elected officials, and yes, sometimes to elect new ones who will in fact take action. Again, we do that at the state level. So I want to talk a little bit about the problem more broadly. Gun violence is often perceived as a city problem, but in fact, gun violence impacts just about every community in Pennsylvania. So many people have stories of people they've lost, loved ones who have lost someone, people who have had close calls or scary moments where they feared gun violence. There is the quiet violence of firearm suicide that Rep. Vinkat mentioned. A lot of people don't actually realize that 60% of the gun violence in Pennsylvania is firearm suicide. And that happens in rural communities as well as our own suburban communities and the city. And I live right up the street in Cranberry, so I'm your neighbor. On average, it's important to know someone in Pennsylvania is shot just about every 2 hours. There's a mass shooting, which is defined as 4 or more people who are either killed or injured by a firearm. There is a mass shooting about every 10 days in Pennsylvania. This is the scary one, I think, for every parent, myself included. Firearms are actually the leading cause of death for children in Pennsylvania. And so again, this is not a one-off situation. This impacts every kind of person, and it is preventable. We don't have to live this way. This is a problem that we have all created. As Rep. Venkat said, we're the only country in, we're one of the only countries with a problem like this, and it is solvable through policy. And in fact, the problem that we now have on our hands is kind of by design. Our leadership has avoided action on this issue for decades because of those well-resourced lobbyists that are in favor of essentially flooding communities with firearms. And so there are a few issues that we need to solve in Pennsylvania. We have a very serious loophole in our background check system. Background checks can stop firearms from being sold to people who have a history of violent crime, a documented history of abuse. And we have a huge gap in our background check system. There are a couple different kinds of firearm sales. So you can buy a handgun or a long gun, like a rifle, at a firearm dealer, a brick and mortar store. In both of those cases, you're required to go through a background check. It's an instant check. In the case of a private sale of a handgun, you still have to go to one of those brick and mortar stores and go through a background check. But we do not require background checks for private sales of long guns like rifles in Pennsylvania. We need to close that loophole. This is the type of firearm that is most commonly used in mass shootings. Why we are ignoring it, I don't know. Well, I do know there are politics in the way, but it is easily solvable. We also have no red flag law that enables us to have firearms temporarily removed from a home where someone has indicated that they're a danger to themselves or others. And so we need that in place so that family members, loved ones can petition a court through a civil proceeding and have a firearm removed in a way that gives a person time to seek help when they're in crisis, right? That's what this is about. Anybody could go through a moment of crisis where they feel like they might hurt themselves or someone else, and we need to provide a mechanism for keeping them safe by removing those deadly firearms from a home. We have no expectation or law that requires safe storage, which would prevent so many accidents. We have no law against ghost guns. Now, for those of you who don't know, ghost guns are kits. You can buy a kit of firearm pieces and assemble that kit at home into a fully functioning firearm. Those kits do not have serial numbers and they do not require background checks. And so for someone who can't pass a background check, that's a very easy way to obtain a firearm. So we have a lot of gaps in our policy that we could solve if we had the right support in the state legislature. We at CeaseFire PA, we are nonpartisan. We will talk to any legislator we can who will take the meeting to try to find common ground and move things forward. We certainly do talk to Republicans, especially in the Senate, to try to find some way to make some progress, because even if we can only get one of these policies passed, we're saving lives. That's our take on it. We know that these things are possible and we're going to keep fighting. I think the thing I want to talk about today is actually not about a piece of legislation, but about the state budget. For those of you who are not aware, every year the state legislature has to approve a budget at the end of June, typically. And that budget includes line items for all kinds of programs. You hear about education funding. Right now, transit funding is a big issue. One that doesn't get as much press that we are working to elevate is community violence intervention programs. So we talk about trauma and the way violence perpetuates itself when people are carrying so much and have seen violence growing up with other people in the community. Community violence intervention programs are designed to identify people who are at risk of committing violence and to provide the counseling, the supports to make sure that they are not using violence to solve conflict in the community. you see community violence intervention programs taking a few different forms. They can happen at the bedside in a hospital. We have a story of a young man who was shot by a former friend. And a community violence intervention worker met that victim in the hospital and was there as the friends of that person were talking about retaliation. They were able to counsel those folks through their grief, through their anger, provide supports. You know, there are all kinds of other risk factors that lead people to commit violence, including poverty and trauma. And there are ways to support people through this. And through that work, this community violence intervention person was able to prevent retaliation. That was a shooting that didn't happen. And we see that kind of story echoing all across Pennsylvania. There are programs in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and York and Reading. And as a result, we've seen firearm deaths from firearm homicide go down 38% in Pennsylvania over the last 2 years. That is only possible because of record investments in these kinds of programs. You can imagine it takes a lot of resources to stand up an organization, to train people, to have people out in the community ready to respond to these kinds of situations. That funding made these kinds of programs possible. There was funding from the federal government. There was funding from the state government. Thank you very much for your support. And this is a particularly tough budget year. We know that a lot of programs are actually being cut. There's a lot of funding to the state that is being cut. The slices of the pie are getting smaller. And yet this is a time when we cannot look at this problem. We cannot say, great, gun homicide deaths are down 38%, job well done. No, we know from other states that when this funding dries up, these programs quickly disappear and violence actually goes back up. Not only that, but 38% isn't enough. We need to get down to 0 and we need to keep it there. So the good news is that at the beginning of the budget process, the governor proposes what he thinks is the best budget. And the governor gave us a great start with $55 million for these kinds of programs. And we know that requests for these grant programs from community violence intervention organizations were way over 100 million in previous years. And so we need to up that number. And we are advocating for that in the state legislature. I am going to pass out a paper after we conclude here that has some QR codes where you can actually go and send a message to your legislators. I'm sorry for any emails you may receive, but if anyone here is not in Rep. Venkat's district, it's very important that you click this link. And this will also send a message to your state senator, who I think is less likely to be kind of supportive without your voice being heard. So it depends. So so we want you to take action there. And then the other piece that I would ask you all to do, good old-fashioned letters to the editor in the paper, they are still very useful. This is the most read portion of local media. It influences the public discourse around these issues. I think legislators do read these notes in the paper. And so we have a guide on how to do that for this issue with talking points and tips. And we hope you'll consider it. And I think that's it for me. But thank you all for coming.
As the representative talked about, what's very, very important is getting the right people here. And one of the right people, that should be in one of the seats, in our legislature is here with us tonight. Arvind Vinkat, would you stand up? Arvind ran a magnificent violence opponents, Valerie Gibbs, I'll say her name. She opposed us at every turn. And Hadley ran a very valiant campaign, paying clubs. I'm hoping that you'll take that mantle on again. How do you do it with some? This one, I don't get questions that anybody has.
Are you gonna have this one?
I'm just, no. It's a nice one. I'm just getting some water. I'm sorry.
I always, I'm Thaddeus, I'm in the church here. And, I'm in those CeaseFire, Pennsylvania, a few years back, there was a coaching state, along that on our boulevard. And Providence Road, where there's something called the Midwest Gun Center. It still exists. And at that time, they were advertising Mother's Day special of learning how to shoot an AK-47.
Oh.
And I'm sure they still are doing that. So how is it that our local municipality has allowed that ability for that organization to exist across the street, it's a big Orthodox church. Across the goes college and the sister provide college. It just doesn't make sense. So what's going on in our municipal governments?
So I guess I'll kind of take that. I will say that zoning regulations are not as stringent as you might think. Municipal governments get worried about being sued related to denial of permits for reasons that aren't clearly articulated within the zoning code. So I can't speak to specific circumstances. And I know the public has raised its voice on this and similar circumstances. All I will say is that elections have consequences, and as a result, change can be made.
Thank you. Anybody else? One more question.
They said because it's legal.
Yeah.
So legality is an issue. AK-47s were not legal one time, they became legal again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? Tom?
Representative Vinkat, you talked about divided government in Harrisburg as it is in other states and as it is in Washington. But I'm just curious, what sort of gun violence proposals might have a realistic chance of getting through both the House and the Senate?
Honestly, I do not see background checks, red flag laws, safe storage laws, reporting of lost and stolen firearms, ghost guns, getting through the House and the Senate in Harrisburg and getting to the governor's desk. I wish that weren't the case, but we barely got background checks and red flag laws through the state house last session. And there was a political price to pay, and it wasn't among Republicans. There was one Republican, maybe two, who stood with us, but a couple of my Democratic colleagues who represent more rural areas, and their constituents were screaming bloody murder for the rest of that term. So if you were to speak with them, they would say the juice is not worth the political squeeze at this point. And as an elected official, I represent 63,000 people in the North Hills, very different than representing 63,000 people in Cambria County or in Luzerne County and Lackawanna County. Very different. And so that's why I'll say it also. I wish Hadley had won. I wish that Nicole Rasciuto had won in her state Senate race. It wasn't a good year for pro-gun safety candidates in general in 2024. DC does not have divided government, or does not have divided government. It has a united government, and as a result, it is united in both stopping gun safety legislation and passing ridiculous things like in this reconciliation bill to say there's no taxation on gun silencers or something like that. So understand that we are playing a very defensive game. On the issue of gun violence prevention funding, there may be some wiggle room there. But the state budget, it is very, very hard this year. Like keeping the lights on is going to be the focus. And especially if DC cuts Medicaid and food assistance, two issues we're not talking about here, two gigantic line items in the state budget. That's going to make doing things like this much, much harder.
Can I,
Anyone else?
sorry, can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
I agree. I agree. And I will say, I don't believe it's that we don't have the votes in the state Senate. I think that if something was put up for a vote, there are people in the state Senate on the other side of the aisle, on the Republican side, who would vote for some of these more common sense things, the background checks loophole, the extreme risk protection orders. But they don't have the leadership to call the votes. So it's literally a few people standing in the way of that getting a vote in committee and at the full floor of the Senate, in my opinion.
There is some truth to that. But in a legislative body, there's a saying, it's not a pleasant saying, but the saying is the minority has its say and the majority has its way.
Yeah.
And so among the majority party, they will talk amongst themselves and they will be reluctant to put bills on the floor that divide themselves. Divide us as 102 Democrats, divide the senators as 27 Republican senators. And so they look for opportunities. And the other factor they have is anything they do that gets to the governor's desk becomes a victory for the governor of an opposite party. So they are the proverbial stopping block for whatever progress happens in Pennsylvania legislatively. And they take some pride in that. And their voters put them in office, presumably knowing that. And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't put pressure on them. We absolutely should. But we got to win elections.
Thank you guys all for being here. Again, we really appreciate coming out. I think just kind of following up and building on that question a little bit more, it feels like even if we had the votes, which it sounds like we don't, but even if we had them, we're still facing, a legal structure, particularly with, Bruin last term from the Supreme Court, that makes it really challenging to directly confront these issues kind of head on in the way that we would like to see, right? Are we thinking more creatively, I think, on these issues like you're talking about with the gun violence intervention specialists and finding policies that we can kind of build on starting blocks that are not tackling the issue straightforward, but using as vehicles to start building victories, to start eroding some of the built-in intransigence to even the topic of conversation until we can get to that point?
So there are huge statewide court races this November, retaining state Supreme Court justice, retaining Commonwealth and Superior Court judges, electing new Commonwealth and Superior Court judges. There is a lot of court-based law that affects change in Pennsylvania, and they are nominally nonpartisan. But the 3 state Supreme Court justices up for retention were all elected in 2015. They were all elected as Democrats. They all, as a result, were able to put a person on the Legislative Reapportionment Commission that resulted in fair maps that led to a evenly divided state house for the first time in 12 years. Pennsylvania is an evenly divided state. We could be 102, 101, either way. Prior to that, we had been as much as 118, 119 Republicans, not remotely a reflection of where Pennsylvania is. pay attention and vote in these judicial elections this year, because they can make a huge difference on the gun issue, on any number of different issues. And so it's important for people to educate themselves and vote accordingly.
Any other questions? Mr. Tim.
Thank you. So this is a somewhat broader question, but it also pertains very much to this. In the last 6 months, essentially, people who are interested in political issues have been asked to send endless emails to legislators. I belong to CeaseFire PA, I belong to Fair Districts PA, I support the Fulbright Association, blah, blah, blah. And I wonder whether this is an effective way of reaching legislators. Obviously, every legislator organizes their office differently, but how do you respond to this barrage of almost identically worded emails coming across the transom?
So there's a hierarchy of communication that comes into my office. Constituent who calls up my office, comes and sits down with me, has a particular agenda item. That is the highest level of communication that I can imagine, because they're taking their time out of their busy day to meet with me in person about an issue they care about, and they want me to start working on it. And 99% of the time I will. Phone calls are next. Personal emails are next. And then the last are the mass emails, which are, as we all know, generated by interest groups that have a button that say, press the button, and your email is going to your legislator. I will tell you what I do with those. I will write a response to the first one that my staff gets. And then every time an email from a constituent comes in with that email, they will get the response that I gave to the very first constituent. Because I can't physically respond to 500 emails that are the exact same email and say that. And frankly, it does not have the same weight as the other 3 forms of communication. It's not that it doesn't matter. Anytime a constituent takes the time for outreach, it absolutely matters, but there is a weighting to it.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Well, if that is the case, I just want to thank our panelists, first of all. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And thank you all who came out and took time from your busy schedule to be here with us. I want to just reinforce what Representative said about the judicial elections that are coming up. They could not be any more important, and people tend to not remember that. So please pay attention to them. Please, the 3 Democrats who are running for reappointment, please consider voting for them and research everyone else. So thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you so much.
God bless.
So sorry. Yes.
You worried me that.
I felt this lingering.
Yeah.